The stone floor of the cathedral leached the warmth straight through the thin soles of Beatrice's slippers. But the cold wasn't what made her shiver. It was the sound of Arthur's laugh, a short, wet exhale that echoed off the vaulted stone the second her first tear fell. He didn't look at her like a bride. He looked at her like a captured fox. Most women would have wept harder. Beatrice just stopped. She wiped her cheek turned on her heavy heel and locked eyes with the man holding the rings, his brother. The air in St. Jude's tasted of stale incense and damp wool. It was a suffocating flavor, thick enough to coat the back of the throat. Beatrice stood at the altar drowning in 40 pounds of imported ivory silk, the corset pulled tight enough by her mother's frantic maid to ensure a 19-inch waist dug a rigid line of pain into her lower ribs with every shallow breath. She was a commodity dressed up and polished, standing at the edge of the precipice. Beside her stood Arthur, the Duke of Westmoreland. He smelled of cloves, expensive pomade, and absolute certainty. He hadn't looked at her since she arrived at his side. His attention was fixed on a point somewhere above the bishop's balding head, his profile sharp and disinterested. The bishop droned on his voice, a monotonous hum that blended with the rhythmic patter of November rain against the stained glass. In the front pew, Beatrice could hear the heavy, wet breathing of her father. She knew without looking that he was sweating a thin sheen of grease across his forehead as he waited for the ink to dry on the social contract that would save him from debtor's prison. She was the collateral, the pretty, quiet daughter traded to a duke who needed a respectable womb to produce his heirs. It wasn't supposed to be an emotional affair. She knew the rules of her world. You traded youth and beauty for titles and security. Love was a ridiculous notion peddled by cheap novelists meant for servant girls and lonely spinsters. Beatrice had resigned herself to a life of comfortable, cold indifference. She had prepared for Arthur's arrogance. She had prepared for his neglect. But as the bishop reached the crucial moment, the exchange of vows, a sudden, unbidden wave of pure exhaustion hit her. It wasn't grief. It wasn't fear. It was just the crushing weight of the charade. The months of pretending to smile at his dull anecdotes, the forced curtsies, the way his hands felt like cold marble when he touched her waist. The tension behind her eyes snapped. A single tear spilled over her lower lashes. It was a hot, humiliating betrayal of her own control. It tracked down her heavily powdered cheek, cutting a wet ravine through the chalky white makeup. She sniffed a tiny, pathetic sound in the cavernous quiet of the cathedral. Arthur turned his head. He looked down at the tear, and then he laughed. It wasn't a booming guffaw. It was a scoff. A small, sharp expulsion of air through his nose, accompanied by a slight curling of his upper lip. He leaned in, his breath hot and smelling faintly of the brandy he'd undoubtedly had for breakfast. "Oh, spare me the theatrics, Beatrice." He whispered, his voice a dry rasp, meant only for her ears. "We both know you aren't weeping for joy, and we both know you don't have the luxury of weeping for sorrow. Dry your face. You're making a fool of yourself." He didn't hand her a handkerchief. He didn't offer a reassuring squeeze of her hand. He just looked at her with an expression of profound, tired boredom. He had won the prize, and now he was already annoyed by the maintenance it required. Something broke inside Beatrice. It wasn't a loud shattering. It was a quiet, metallic snap, like the mainspring of a pocket watch giving out. The fear evaporated. The desperate need to appease her father to secure the future burned away in a sudden icy flood of spite. She looked at Arthur. Really looked at him. At the faint burst blood vessels around his nose. At the cold, dead blue of his eyes. He was a tyrant in a tailored coat, and he was going to spend the next 40 years slowly grinding her into dust for his own amusement. She breathed in. The air tasted of dust and defiance. Beatrice lifted her gloved hand and wiped the tear away. The rough Brussels lace scratched her skin, leaving a red welt. She didn't look back at the altar. She didn't look at her gasping father in the front row. She turned 90 degrees to her left. Standing there holding a velvet cushion with 2 heavy gold bands was Thomas. Thomas was a shadow. He was the younger brother by 4 years, a man who had spent his entire life standing precisely 2 steps behind the Duke of Westmoreland. If Arthur was carved from marble, Thomas was whittled from rough, knotty wood. He lacked the symmetry of his brother. His nose had been broken in a hunting accident and never set quite right. His hair was a darker, muddier brown, constantly escaping the confines of his collar. He wore a cravat that looked as though it had been tied in the dark by a man with a headache. He didn't smell like cloves. As Beatrice stepped toward him, the heavy silk of her gown dragging across the stone, she caught the scent of him. Pipe tobacco, leather polish, the faint metallic tang of ink. Thomas's dark eyes widened a fraction as she stopped in front of him. He didn't drop the cushion, but his knuckles went white. Beatrice, he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "Come with me," she said. It wasn't a request. She reached out and grabbed his wrist. His skin was burning hot against the cold silk of her gloves. She felt the heavy thudding rhythm of his pulse beneath her thumb. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, glancing over her shoulder at Arthur, who was currently staring at Beatrice's back with an expression of slack-jawed confusion. Then Thomas looked back at her. He didn't ask questions. He let her pull him. They walked right past the altar, past the sputtering bishop, and ducked into the narrow, arched doorway of the sacristy. The heavy oak door swung shut behind them, cutting off the sudden rising hiss of whispers from the congregation. The sacristy was dim, lit only by a single high window that let in the gray November light. It smelled of old paper and beeswax. Beatrice let go of his wrist and leaned against a heavy oak table, her chest heaving against the unyielding constraints of her corset. Her hands were shaking violently. Thomas stood in the center of the room. He carefully set the velvet cushion down on a stack of hymnals. He didn't speak. He just watched her, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his trousers. "I can't do it," Beatrice choked out. The adrenaline was beginning to curdle into panic in her stomach. "I will die in that house. He will kill me slowly." "He usually does," Thomas said quietly. Beatrice looked up. The cynicism in his voice matched the bitter taste in her own mouth. Thomas didn't love his brother. The aristocracy liked to pretend their bloodlines were bound by loyalty, but Beatrice knew the truth. Inheritance was a zero-sum game, and Thomas was the loser. He lived on a modest allowance, managing the secondary estates constantly subjected to Arthur's petty tyrannies. "Marry me instead." The words fell out of her mouth before she could weigh them. They hit the stone floor like lead weights. Thomas froze. He pulled his hands out of his pockets. "You're hysterical. I am perfectly lucid," she snapped, stepping toward him. The rustle of her dress sounded like a wildfire in the small room. "My father's creditors will accept any aristocratic marriage. They don't care if it's the Duke or the Duke's brother as long as the debts are guaranteed. You have the Blackwood estate in your name, don't you?" "It's a sheep farm in Yorkshire, Beatrice. It's not Westmoreland." "I don't care about Westmoreland. I care about not waking up every morning wishing I'd swallowed arsenic the night before." She pointed a trembling gloved finger at the door. He laughed at me. He looked at me like I was a mare with a bad tooth. Thomas looked away, his jaw tightening. A muscle ticked in his cheek. He walked over to the window, staring out at the rain. "If we do this," Thomas said, his voice stripped of any polite veneer, "we will be pariahs. Arthur will cut me off entirely. Your family will be a laughingstock. Society will bar its doors to us. We will have nothing but a drafty manor house in the north and the clothes on our backs." "Will he be there?" she asked. Thomas looked back over his shoulder. "Arthur." "No. He hates Yorkshire. Complains the air smells like dirt." Beatrice let out a harsh, breathless laugh. "Then it sounds like paradise." She walked up behind him. She didn't touch him, but she stood close enough to feel the heat radiating off his wool coat. "Do you despise me, Thomas?" He turned around. He looked down at her, his dark eyes tracing the harsh line of her jaw, the smudged powder on her cheek, the furious, terrified defiance in her gaze. It wasn't a romantic look. It was an assessment. He was weighing the cost of ruin against the pleasure of taking the one thing his brother had claimed as his own. "No," Thomas said softly. "I don't despise you." He reached past her and picked up the velvet cushion. He plucked the smaller gold band from the indentation in the velvet. He held it between his thumb and forefinger, examining it. "It won't be a love match," Thomas warned her, his eyes cold and pragmatic. "I am not a hero. I am a man who is sick to death of watching a tyrant take whatever he pleases." "I don't need a hero," Beatrice replied, lifting her chin. "I need an accomplice." Thomas's mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, but it was the closest thing she had seen to one all morning. "Then let us go commit a crime." The heavy oak door of the sacristy groaned as Thomas pulled it open. The noise in the cathedral hit them like a physical blow. The polite whispering had escalated into a chaotic hum. People were standing in the pews, craning their necks. Her father was leaning heavily on his walking stick, his face a mottled, dangerous purple, and standing exactly where they had left him, looking like a thundercloud wrapped in fine tailoring, was Arthur. Beatrice stepped out first. She didn't lower her eyes. She kept her spine rigid, letting the heavy train of her dress drag over the stone. Thomas walked half a step behind her, his limp slightly more pronounced now, his face a mask of absolute indifference. The crowd parted as they approached the altar. The bishop took a step back, clutching his prayer book to his chest, as if it could protect him from the sheer scandal unfolding before him. "What is the meaning of this?" Arthur barked. The polished veneer was entirely gone. His voice echoed harsh and ugly off the stone arches. He grabbed Beatrice's arm, his fingers digging bruisingly into her bicep through the silk. "Get back to your place." Before Beatrice could flinch, a large calloused hand clamped down on Arthur's wrist. Thomas didn't shout. He didn't flex. He simply applied pressure. The knuckles of his hand turned white, and slowly, agonizingly, Arthur's fingers uncurled from Beatrice's arm. "Do not touch her," Thomas said. His voice was quiet, but it carried. Arthur stared at his younger brother in utter shock. The shock quickly curdled into a furious sneer. "Have you lost your mind, Tommy? Let go of me before I have you thrown out into the mud." "You don't own the church, Arthur," Thomas replied, stepping smoothly between his brother and Beatrice. He turned his back on the Duke, a profound gesture of disrespect that caused an audible gasp from the front pew. Thomas looked at the bishop. The old man was shaking his eyes, darting frantically between the two brothers. "We are ready to continue," Thomas said clearly. "But you will be directing the vows to me." "My lord," the bishop stammered, sweat pooling in his collar. I cannot. The banns were read for the Duke of Westmoreland. This is highly irregular. It is scandalous. It is a legal transfer of a marriage license, provided both parties consent." Thomas interrupted smoothly, pulling a folded piece of parchment from his inner coat pocket. He slapped it onto the altar. "The license is made out to the House of Westmoreland. I carry the name as well as he does. Read the vows, bishop or I will find a magistrate who will, and the church will lose the rather substantial donation I intended to make this afternoon." It was a bluff. Beatrice knew Thomas didn't have the money for a substantial donation, but the bishop didn't know that. Arthur stepped forward, his face contorted with rage. "This is a farce. She is mine. The contract is signed. The financial contract is signed." Beatrice spoke up. Her voice trembled, but she forced the words out past the lump of terror in her throat. "The spiritual contract requires my verbal consent, which you do not have, your grace." She turned her back on Arthur. She faced Thomas. The silence in the cathedral was absolute. It was the silence of 100 people holding their breath, watching a carriage careen toward a cliff edge. Thomas held out his hand. He didn't wear gloves. His hand was rough, the knuckles scarred from old fights and manual labor. There was ink stained deep into the cuticle of his index finger. Beatrice placed her hand in his. His grip was firm. It wasn't gentle, but it was solid. It was the grip of a man pulling someone over a wall. Proceed, Thomas ordered the bishop. The bishop swallowed hard. With trembling hands, he opened the book. He skipped the preamble. He went straight to the binding words. His voice cracked as he asked the question. I do, Thomas said. The words hit the cold air like a hammer striking an anvil. I do? Beatrice echoed. Her voice sounded thin, frail, but the finality of it sent a shockwave through her own body. Thomas took the ring. The heavy gold band meant for a duke. He slid it onto Beatrice's finger. It was cold, and it was slightly too big, hanging loosely on her slender knuckle. She took the second ring from him. It was meant for Arthur's manicured fingers. She pushed it onto Thomas's rough-scarred finger. It stuck at the knuckle, and she had to force it over the joint. He didn't flinch. I pronounce you man and wife, the bishop whispered, looking thoroughly sick. You may kiss the bride, Thomas muttered, finishing the man's sentence for him. He didn't wait for permission. He stepped into her space. He didn't tilt her chin up delicately. He simply ducked his head and pressed his mouth to hers. It was an awkward, terrible kiss. Their noses bumped. Her teeth scraped against his bottom lip. He smelled of peppermint and the sharp tang of cheap gin. It lacked any grace, any romance. It was the messy, desperate sealing of a pact made in a moment of pure madness. When he pulled away, he looked down at her. His chest was rising and falling rapidly. For a second beneath the cynical, hard exterior, Beatrice saw the same terrified realization that was clawing at her own insides. What have we just done? Come! Thomas said, his voice rough. He didn't offer his arm. He grabbed her hand again, his fingers lacing tightly through hers. He turned, pulling her with him. They walked down the aisle. The faces of the congregation blurred into a smear of pale, shocked expressions. Somewhere to her left, Beatrice heard her mother let out a sharp, high-pitched whine before slumping into her aunt's shoulder. Her father was staring at her with a look of murderous hatred. Behind them at the altar, Arthur stood in frozen disbelief. The sneer had vanished, replaced by the ugly, slack-jawed reality of a man who had just been robbed in broad daylight. Beatrice kept her eyes on the heavy wooden doors at the end of the aisle. Her corset bit into her ribs. Her feet ached. The ring felt heavy and alien on her hand. Thomas pushed the doors open. The cold, wet November wind hit them instantly, whipping Beatrice's veil around her face and stinging her cheeks. The rain was coming down in sheets, turning the cobblestone street into a gray, muddy river. They stepped out into the storm, leaving the suffocating heat and the shocked silence of the cathedral behind them. There was no carriage waiting for them. There was no cheering crowd. There was only the rain, the cold, and the terrifying, uncharted reality of the ruin they had just chosen. The rain did not care that she was a bride. It lashed against them in vicious sideways sheets, instantly plastering the 40 pounds of imported ivory silk to Beatrice's legs. Within 10 steps, the hem of her gown was heavy with brown street mud, dragging behind her like a waterlogged corpse. Keep moving. Thomas grunted, his hand still locked around hers. He pulled her down the cobblestone street away from the imposing shadow of St. Jude's. The wind howled, snatching the veil from Beatrice's hair. She let it go. It fluttered away into the gray afternoon like a surrendered flag landing in a puddle of horse urine. She didn't look back. Her thin slippers were useless. Freezing water seeped through the soles, numbing her toes instantly. She was shivering so violently her teeth rattled a sharp clicking sound, lost beneath the roar of the downpour and the clatter of passing carriages. Thomas dragged her toward the corner of a busy intersection, holding his free arm up to hail a hackney cab. 3 passed them by the drivers, taking one look at the soaking, mud-streaked woman in a ruined wedding gown, and the grim-faced man beside her, and whipping their horses faster. "Damn it!" Thomas hissed. He tasted rain and soot. He dropped her hand and stepped directly into the street, placing himself in the path of a rickety black cab. The horse reared with frantic whinny hooves striking the wet stone. The driver cursed violently, cracking his whip against the side of the cab. "Are you mad?" The driver screamed down at them, his face hidden behind a sodden wool cap. "North Station!" Thomas yelled over the rain, yanking the carriage door open. "I have silver." The driver hesitated, his eyes narrowing at Beatrice's ruined finery. Thomas didn't wait for permission. He grabbed Beatrice by the waist. His hands were large, and even through the thick wet silk and rigid whalebone corset, she felt the sheer functional strength of him as he practically hoisted her into the carriage. She collapsed onto the cracked leather seat. It smelled intensely of wet dog-stale ale and old dust. It was the best thing she had ever smelled. Thomas climbed in behind her and slammed the door shut. The carriage lurched forward, throwing Beatrice against the wooden wall. She gasped, the corset driving a brutal line of agony into her battered ribs. Inside the dim cab, the silence between them was suddenly deafening, punctuated only by the rhythmic squeak of a loose wheel and the drumming rain. They were entirely alone. Beatrice hugged herself, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. The chill was setting into her marrow. She looked at Thomas. He was dripping wet, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his cheap cravat a sodden gray mess around his throat. He was staring at his left hand, at the heavy ornate gold ring of the Duke of Westmoreland. He slowly curled his hand into a fist, the metal catching the faint light from the window. Then he looked up at her. His dark eyes were bloodshot exhaustion already bleeding through the adrenaline. "He will freeze our accounts before sunset." Thomas said, his voice flat, devoid of any romantic reassurances. "Your father will disown you. Arthur will likely hire men to drag us back, if only to annul the marriage and throw me in the Fleet for theft. Then we must be far away before sunset," Beatrice replied. Her voice shook, but she kept her chin level. "The mail coach leaves at 2. It is cheap, it is brutal, and it will take 3 days to reach Yorkshire." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, peering at her through the gloom. "You are bleeding, Beatrice." She blinked, confused. She looked down at her hands. Her left wrist was raw and smeared with blood. The Brussels lace glove had been torn, the rough friction of Arthur's brutal grip, and Thomas's desperate pull having scraped the skin away. She touched it. It stung sharply. "It's nothing," she whispered. But the sight of the blood, stark red against the muddy white silk, finally broke the dam. A choked sob tore out of her throat. She clamped her hand over her mouth, terrified of weeping in front of him. She had spent a year practicing stoicism for Arthur. She didn't know how to be anything else. Thomas didn't try to comfort her. He didn't move to the seat beside her or offer empty platitudes. He simply reached into his coat, pulled out a relatively dry, faintly tobacco-scented handkerchief, and tossed it onto her lap.